Yeah, so I wanted to start this talk by telling you guys of an encounter I had with a coworker recently. He, uh, he was asking me how I could tell the difference between two species of muley, and I described it in the only way I knew how, which was in technical terms. And I got done describing how I could tell them apart, and he looked at me and he said, "You're speaking another language." And I thought, that's a really good point, because a lot of the terms, sort of like the botanical shorthand terms, are very foreign to the majority of people. And so in that way, learning these terms and learning how to be familiar with different parts of a grass and different adjectives that describe how a grass is sort of like learning another language. And so what I want to do in this talk is briefly spend some time talking about what grasses are and why we should identify them or be interested in identifying them. And then I want to share with you guys some tools and techniques that you can use to kind of dive into the world of Grass ID. And then I want to spend, I would say, the majority of this talk today talking about some of these basic parts of grass anatomy and certain adjectives and things to look for when you're in the field looking at grasses. And then, like I said, we'll pause for questions, and then we're going to play a video, and this is the video that Lynn was really integral in putting together, and this was at Lake Arrowhead State Park, and it's just this was filmed earlier this month, so it's grasses that most of which will probably still be in flower. So after the video, if you want, you can go out, maybe on a cooler day, you can go out and look at these grasses for yourself, but we're just going to be looking at what's blooming and how we can identify it, some of the features that are helpful. So how many grasses can any of you name? I know most people, like the average person, can't name, maybe 3 grasses if they're doing, if they know maybe the different types of grasses they can put in their lawn, or the weeds, maybe crabgrass they know. As master naturalists, I suspect a lot of you are more well-versed in your grasses. You might know this grass here as the state grass of Texas, Bouteloua curtipendula, or Sidotes gramma. You might recognize this grass as an invasive roadside weed, Johnson grass. And if you're into birds, you might know that the painted bunting likes to eat the seeds of cupgrass. But what about this little grass? Or this one? And there are so many grasses in our area, especially with us being part of a plains, like a prairie area, that are really crucial to our ecosystems and our habitat. And why do we care? Why do we care about learning the names of these grasses? Well, first of all, grasses are a big component of the primary producers, right? So things that can make their own food. And so in our ecosystems around here, grasses make up a large portion of those primary producers. We can, if we know our grasses and we're able to identify them, we can assess habitat quality and the rate of soil erosion in an area. So if you've got grasses that have a lot of big roots, you're going to be able to maintain soil and maintain habitat quality. And also, if you've got a diverse mix of grasses, they'll be able to feed a diverse group of animals. And if you are familiar with grasses, you can be able to identify invasive or potentially noxious species of grass. If you're a land manager or you know someone who has land, you can help them manage their land by pointing out these grasses. Or say you're visiting a state park or a wildlife management area. Maybe you see something out there that probably isn't the best. What you can do is you can tell the ranger, hey, do you know that this is here? And then you can also, if you know your grasses and you know your plants, you can understand how to recognize interspecific relationships or relationships between different species. So you can say, well, I see this grass occurring often in this plant community or with these species. Or maybe this pollinator really prefers this grass over another species of grass. And then for me, my primary motivator is just knowing for the sake of knowing. I really like just being able to identify the things around me so that I can make informed observations about different plants and animals. And like I said, I still have a long ways to go. in that regard. So brief introduction, what is a grass and what is not a grass? So typically flowering plants or angiosperms can be divided into two groups. They can be divided into dicotyledonous plants or dicots and monocotyledonous plants or the monocots. And as their name implies, it just refers to the number of embryonic leaves in the plant. So monocots have one embryonic leaf and dicots have two. There are also some other characteristics. You know, grasses are, of course, monocots. And there are some other characteristics, not all of which I mentioned here, that are generally, that differentiate the two. So monocots tend to not have a taproot. They have what are called adventitious roots, or roots that just spread out in all directions. They don't have woody stems, with the exception of palms, which can have what looks like a trunk, but it's actually a different vasculature system than, say, like an oak tree. They often have parallel, or they always have parallel leaf venation in our monocots, but there are some dicots that do that as well. And then their flower parts are in threes. So monocots contain the group that we call grasses, but there are more types of monocots than just grasses. So grasses are plants in the family Poaceae. This is the grass family. So all of the plants that we're going to be talking about today and the parts that I'm going to be talking about today refer to this family of grasses, Poaceae. And there are a lot of important food crops in here. Some of them I've listed: corn, rice, sugarcane, and then of course all of the plants that we know as grasses. But there are some things that occur, some of which occur in our area, that shouldn't be mistaken for grasses. We don't have too many wild orchids around here, but we have things called sedges and rushes that if you look at them, you might think, oh, that's a grass. But they're actually not in this Poaceae family. They're a monocot, but they're not a grass. Same thing with onions, garlic, and asparagus, and all of our bulb plants, and as I mentioned before, palms. So these are monocots, but they're not grasses. So I want to talk a little bit about different resources that you can use to help you in your identification. The first one I'm going to talk about is accessible to everybody. It's just a virtual herbarium, or a place where you can look at photos and collection information of plants from Texas A&M's AgriLife webpage called rangeplants.tamu.edu, or Plants of Texas Rangelands. And I'll talk a little bit more about it here. So once you get to this webpage, and what I've done here, how I got to this page was I selected under distributions our area, the Rolling Plains area. And then I went over here where it says narrow results by, and I put in the family as a filter. I selected families, and then I selected that Poaceae family again. And remember, that's all grasses. So if I'm looking at a grass and I say, well, I wonder if it's in this herbarium from the AgriLife extension, you can go here and then they're alphabetized and you can scroll through, or if you're not sure what it is, you can look at these images, or maybe you've narrowed it down to 2 and you want to look at some different photos. This is a good resource for that sort of work, just looking at images and collection data. And again, this is accessible. This is just on the internet. And I'm sure there are a lot of other useful web resources that I'm not familiar with. So feel free to look around for whatever works best for you on the internet. But aside from the internet, I think there are some really handy guides and books that you can procure, and different apps as well, that some of which I found really useful. And so the first one is this Field Guide to Common Texas Grasses. Now, normally this is listed at the TAMU Press, the A&M University Publishers site, for $30. And I bought mine a while ago for $10 because it was on sale. And I looked this morning and it's still on sale. So this is a steal for $10. It's about a 300-page guide. And is that backwards? I don't know. But it's a really useful book. It's got color photos of grasses. find a good one. And it's got a good description. It's got a description of the genus, where it occurs in the state of Texas by county. And then it's got a full glossary and a full illustrated diagrams in the front to help you get acquainted with the grass types. So a lot of the stuff I'm going to be talking about in this lecture can also be found in this book. This is a great book for beginners or intermediates alike. I would strongly recommend The Field Guide to Common Texas Grasses. Another book that's really useful is the one I have photographed, or the photograph in the bottom right corner. And that's, not only is it a glossary of terms that you are most likely not familiar with, but it does a really good job of illustrating the exact part of the plant that it's referring to. A lot of times, in order to define technical plant terms, glossaries will use other technical plant terms, and you'll have to kind of go on this rabbit chase of looking up terms. And then by the time you get to the last term to look up, you've forgotten what you were looking up in the first place. And that's really why I like this glossary, is because it's really handy for people who just want to look at exactly the part of the plant that a term is referring to. And there are a lot of editions of this book, and if you get an older edition, they can be really affordable. Even the new editions, I think, are only $20 or $30. And this isn't just for grasses, this is for all plants. So I would strongly recommend both of these books to anyone looking to get started. And of course, you can use iNaturalist. However, I want to put out the word of warning that the software that analyzes the photos that you upload to iNaturalist and suggests identifications for you is not as effective with grasses. It doesn't do as good of a job. Often it will tell you it's in the grass family, but that's about all it will do. And in order to, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't post to iNaturalist, because I think it's still important species data if we can get those posts up there. But we need to take good pictures of different parts of the plant, because some parts are more important in ID than others. And we also need to make sure that we don't rely on iNaturalist alone to identify our grass. So we need to do a little bit of groundwork when it comes to grasses on iNaturalist. And then there at the bottom is just the link to that virtual herbarium again. So when you're out in the field, what should you bring with you? What items are helpful, and how do you use them? For grasses especially, it's important to have some sort of magnification tool. As we'll get into shortly, there are a lot of parts of grasses that are really tiny and difficult to see with your naked eye. And trying to look at those parts and analyze those parts with your naked eye can be frustrating. And especially in the field, it's really nice to have some kind of a hand lens. And this is just a little magnifying loupe that you can use to look at all kinds of things, really. But in this case, we'll be looking at grass flowers and whether or not there are hairs on the grass. You can use like a 10x lens. That's a pretty common one. But for grasses, I like something 30x or 30 times magnification or higher. And down here at the bottom, this image is from Bezos World. I went to Amazon and I found this one. This is a 40x loupe. It's very similar to the one I have. So it's like a metal, it like folds into like the shape of a teardrop, but then it unfolds and you've got, this is the battery pack. It's got an LED light in it. And I would say that that's also really helpful for looking at your grasses. So if you can't afford, 10 or 15 bucks for a lit hand lens, I would strongly recommend it. This one and mine as well also have UV lights, which I don't normally use, but you never know when you might need to look at something under UV. It's also nice to carry with you a ruler because a lot of the field guides will ask you how long the leaves are, or how long, something called a ligule is, or how big the spikelets are. And so for these things, it's nice to have a ruler. And a lot of those books or sources where you're looking at these descriptions will have it in metric. So it's nice to be able to, have a millimeter, centimeter ruler with you when you're in the field. And then, of course, there are going to be things that you want to capture and look at for later. And you can either do that in the form of note-taking. You can write a description of everything that you see or draw a picture, illustrate the grass, or with a camera, or both. I like to do both. I like to take a whole bunch of pictures and then either on paper or in my head, I like to, take mental notes of, where was this grass? How was it growing? How tall was it? Was it fuzzy? These kinds of things. So a notebook and camera are really critical for capturing the details you'll need to identify your grass. And if you want to ID your grass in the field while you're there with it, you can take a field guide. I normally leave mine at the house and I just take really good notes. And then I compare them to the field guides because I've got like 2 or 3 books at the house and I don't carry them with me every time I go out into the field. And if you really want to get fancy, this is not essential at all. You could get a dissection microscope. Maybe you already have access to one. If you're going to be looking at plants and grasses all day long, I would recommend this, but it's definitely not a necessity. So a lot of people ask me, what do I look for when I'm looking at a grass for ID? Well, there are 3 general things that you can look at that don't require a lot of special terms. Just general characteristics about your plant. And then the 4th thing are all of the anatomical features. And those are a lot more, I think, detailed, and that's where a lot of the technical terminology comes in. So I'm going to talk here briefly about the first 3, and then we're going to dive into the anatomical parts of the grass for the remainder of my talk. So the first thing you want to ask yourself is, when is it growing? And specifically, when is it flowering? Because you always want to make sure that the grass you're identifying is flowering if you can, because that will make it so much easier for you, because identifying grasses without flowers is difficult, if not impossible sometimes. So I would strongly recommend not wasting your time, banging your head against a field guide trying to identify a grass without any really distinguishable characteristics. That can be really tricky and discouraging. So when is it flowering? Is it flowering in the fall? And if so, it's probably not the grass that looks similar that normally blooms in February. So this can be a useful tool for identifying your grass when it's growing season and it's flowering season. And then the other thing is, how does it grow? This is a word we call habit, and it just refers to the general growth form of the plant. So we can say a plant has a bunch habit or a tufted habit. This is a word we call a cespitose. It just means a tufted grass, like this image here in the top right corner. This is what's called a tufted or cespitose grass. Or it can be kind of leaning over a little bit. Maybe the stems fall towards the ground. We call that decumbent or prostrate. Or it can be a stoloniferous habit, meaning that it's low to the ground and it'll send off these above ground lateral stems that can then make roots and make new plants. So that would be its habit, that it's stoloniferous. And so that's another generic thing you can look at just very quickly at a grass. And then habitat, or where does it grow? What kind of environments does this grass like? Do you only see it growing in dense shade? Do you only see it growing in wet areas? Do you see it growing everywhere? Maybe you only see it on dry, rocky slopes in full sun. These characteristics are also helpful in making an ID and just understanding how that plant behaves in general. And then we have anatomical features. So what are the nitty-gritty details you want to look at when you've got a plant specimen in front of you in the field? Well, you want to take note of its size. How tall is it? Is it up to your knee? Is it up to your waist? Is it taller than you? Is the plant hairy anywhere? Are there hairs on the leaves? Are there hairs on the stem? Are there hairs on the flower? The presence of hairs can really be telltale in a lot of grasses. And then if it is hairy, what do the hairs look like? Are they really long and shaggy? Are they really short? Are they kind of rough to the touch, like sandpaper? These are all really helpful things to note when you're looking at a plant. So that would be something that you could put in the notes in iNaturalist. Maybe you didn't get a good photo, but you could say that you observed that there were a lot of hairs maybe on the leaf. And then the size and shape of the inflorescence or the flowering stalk is very helpful as well. Again, this is the part of the grass that will be the most informative in making your ID. And if you can get a good picture of the flowering part of the grass and put that on a naturalist, it will usually give you a pretty good idea of a genus, or it'll probably give you a few different genera. So it'll kind of narrow it down a little bit for you if you can get a good picture of the flower. So it might help to carry in the field something with a solid background that you can put that flower up against. And then you can get a really good shot of the flowering portion of the grass. And then some more technical terms, right? How many florets are there in a spikelet? What do the nodes and internodes, ligule or collar look like? And if you're saying, what on earth are you talking about? Don't worry, that's what we're gonna get into next. So we're gonna spend the next few slides talking about some anatomy, some definitions with both illustrations like I've got here, and then I've got some pictures that I've taken that illustrate these things as well. So bear with me here. We're gonna define a whole bunch of things, and don't feel like you have to memorize them all right now. It took me months and months to memorize these words. So the first thing that you'll see if you're looking at a book of talking about grasses, they might mention the culm. So we're gonna talk about that. That's just the stem. It's the stem of the grass plant, and it starts here at the roots and it goes all the way to the top of the flower, which you can't see in this image. So here we can see this stem goes all the way through, and it's kind of obscured at times by parts of the leaf, but the culm is always in there. Nodes are just joints along the stem. So if you think about a piece of bamboo, or maybe you're familiar with giant cane, there are these little swollen areas along the stem, along the culm, and those are called nodes. And everything in between those two nodes is called an internode. So for example, we have a node here, we've got a node up here at the top on this illustration, and then the part of the stem in between them is called the internode. And then we've got the blade of the leaf. So the blade of the leaf is just the portion of the leaf that protrudes from the culm or the stem. So in this blade here, we can see that this is just what you would call a leaf, right? It just comes off of the main stem, and it's the photosynthetic portion of the leaf. And that's all that it does. But you'll note that the leaf doesn't attach to the stem right here. It doesn't end here. It keeps going into what we call the sheath. And so the leaf sheath is the portion of the leaf that is wrapped around the culm, and it's actually attached right down here. So we could say that in its entirety, the leaf goes from the point of attachment to the culm through this portion called the sheath, and then also this portion called the blade. So the leaf of a grass is kind of divided into two parts. Now, at the point that these two parts meet is of interest. It's called the collar. So where the blade meets the sheath, this area right here is what we call the collar. And there are a lot of times there will be things there that are indicative, like there might be a weird flare of tissue at the collar. There might be a bunch of hairs. It might be inflated, or it just means that it's got, you know, a growth around the culm. So that's a very indicative, there can be indicative features in the collar. And another thing you'll find in that same region of the grass is what's called a ligule. And a ligule, it took me forever to understand what a ligule was, but it's something, it's a little, kind of like a little projection that's found on the inside of the leaf blade where the leaf blade meets the leaf sheath. And it kind of delineates, you can think of it as delineating the blade from the sheath. And I have a really good photo of a ligule on the next slide. Ligules can be of membranes or they can be of hairs. So here I've got a grass. We'll start with this top left photo. This is a big blue stem. And I like this image because it's a really good, this grass has a really well-defined ligule. It's very easy to see. And so what we've got here is the stem of the grass plant, the culm. And what I've done here is I've pulled back the leaf. And so in between my index and middle finger is the leaf blade. And so it's going in between, so that's the blade starts right here and it goes in between my fingers. And then under my thumb here is the leaf sheath. So this is the portion that was wrapped around the stem. And you can see here, there's this little flare of tissue before it gets narrower. That's the collar, this region right here. And then in between these two, the blade and the sheath, there's this weird vertical projection that doesn't look like it really does anything. And that's the ligule. This is a ciliate membrane, which just means that it's like a sort of a translucent projection off of the leaf sheath that has these sort of fringed ends. That's the cilia, these kind of fringed hairs, or it's not hairs, it's like these little tissues. And so the ligule, all grasses have a ligule, but it might be very, very minute. You might not see it at all. Or it might be something like this where it's very pronounced. And sometimes the ligules are fuzzy. They're just a whole bunch of hairs sticking up. So the ligule is a very cool thing. If you can get photos of a ligule, I would strongly recommend that you do. And if you can't get a photograph of a ligule when you're looking at a grass, this would be a place where note-taking would come in. If you just take a note, or if you could get a ruler right there and say, well, how long is this ligule? That's another good thing to take note of. And here's the same grass on the bottom right corner, just of a different, I hadn't pulled back the leaf blade. So you can see how it rests in the grass normally. So here's the blade coming off of the culm, the stem going diagonally through the photo. And then you see here, this is the ligule, this kind of pale white projection. It almost looks like a little blanket or a little poncho wrapped around the culm. So that's what we talk about when we say, when we're talking about the ligule of a grass. So we talked about the stem and some of the, we talked about stolons. Briefly, I'll just mention rhizomes are the parts, the lateral stems underneath the surface of the soil. And so if you've ever tried to dig up Bermuda grass, then you're very familiar with rhizomes, right? We call them sometimes like runners under the ground, and they'll root and then they'll make new plants. So the difference between a rhizome and a stolon is just whether they occur below ground or above ground. And then I wanted to talk also about the flowers of the plant. So like I said, this is a very critical feature, a critical region to look at when you're looking at identifying a grass. And you want to make sure, if at all possible, that you can wait until the grass flowers to identify it, just to save you time and frustration. So when I say the word inflorescence, I'm just referring to the entire portion of the grass that flowers. That includes the main stem that the flower parts are attached to. And then the basic unit of a grass flower is what we could call a spikelet. A spikelet is just a structure that contains one to many florets or flower containing structures. And so we have an image of a spikelet right here in the top right corner of this diagram. A spikelet always begins with a pair of protective leaves called glumes. And glumes can be very short, or they can be as long as or longer than the spikelet itself. That's highly variable. And it's one of the things that you can use to identify your grass. So here we've got first glume and second glume, these leaves that protect or subtend the spikelet. And then we've got all of these other little projections in here. These are each of these is called a floret. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 florets in this spikelet. Each spikelet can have 1 to many florets. Now a floret is just a part of the grass flower, or the grass spikelet rather, that contains a flower. Sometimes they're sterile, but there will always be something inside of it. And so the floret is also comprised of a couple different parts. So in the bottom left of this diagram, we see a close-up of a floret, and we see it has another pair of protective leaves. And each of these has a different name. The first one I'll talk about, the outer leaf, is called the lemma. The lemma is a protective membrane, or it's usually a little bit leathery, and it and the other leaf protect the flower. The lemma will often have an awn, and the awn of the lemma can help you distinguish, whether it's present or absent, and how long it is, are often highly variable between different species of grass. And it's a characteristic that a lot of keys will talk about. And then the other leaf we have here is called the palea. The palea is usually thin and often wrapped up inside of the lemma. And in between these two modified leaves are the flower parts that you'll recognize. So they have anthers, they have stigmas, or the male and female parts of the flower respectively. And that's where the ovary is. So that's where the seed will be produced. Now, they can be either male or female, or they can be bisexual florets. But that's, a little bit more technical than I think we ought to get into here. Because once you start dissecting a floret, you can find all sorts of things. But often, a lot of places, a lot of books and resources will just ask you about the lemma and the palea. And you can see here in the spikelet diagram that the lemma often obscures much of the palea. The palea is not really that visible unless you pull the lemma and the palea apart and look at them separately. So here I have a picture that I've taken. This is 30 times magnification, or 30x. This was using my hand lens. And you can see this is the same grass we were looking at before, the big blue stem. And one thing that's neat about this grass is it's got a really fuzzy pair of glooms. So the glooms are really hairy. So the first gloom, you can see, right, this very long structure. And then the second gloom is of a different size. It's this shorter one. You can see the tip of it kind of sticking out from these hairs, but it's mostly obscured. So those are our glooms. And then our lemma is this middle projection. The palea is wrapped up inside of the lemma, and so is our flower, right? So our flower is wrapped up in between this lemma and then the palea. That's not really visible in this image. And then projecting from the lemma is this long hair-like projection called the awn. This one's got a really, really distinctive awn. And it actually has a little bend in it. And that's another feature that you can use to identify, or a note that you can take about your grass, is that it has what's called a geniculate awn, or an awn that has a bend in it. But again, that's a little bit more technical than I think we ought to worry about today. So now that we know what a flower is, what a spikelet is, we can talk about different types of inflorescences or flowering structures and shapes. There are a lot more than this in the grass world, but I think for today, these three cover a really good percentage of grass inflorescence types. These are kind of the basic ones that you'll see. And so the first one on the far left is what's called a raceme. And so you'll see that each of these little structures, this is the spikelet, and the spikelet, spikelets are born singly on a little stalk off of the main stem. Now this stalk is called the pedicel. It's just the part of the, it's like a stem that is immediately below the flower, the pedicel. So the spikelet is born on a pedicel off of the main stem. So we've got our main stem going through the middle, and we've got these solitary single spikelets. Now we'll contrast that with a panicle, where the spikelets are still on a pedicel, so they still have a stalk beneath them, but that stalk doesn't attach to the main stem, it attaches to a branch off of the main stem. So you get this sort of compound branching, and it can be branched once, like in this case, or it can be rebranched such that all of these branches have, like maybe this pedicel has other pedicels coming off of it. And this is just what we call a panicle. And I'll talk a little bit about different types of panicles in a minute. And then on the far right, here, we've got what's called a spike. And it's very similar to a raceme, except the spikelets aren't on pedicels or little flower stalks. They're just on the main stem. And so if you want to see what these look like, I've got some examples. So these are photos that I've taken throughout the months. This one on the left is Lolium peren. You can see here the glooms, these lower leaves, are attached immediately to the culm, the stem of the grass. There's no stalk here. So that's what we call a spikelet. Or I'm sorry, a spike. Because the spikelets are not on a stalk. They're what we would call a sessile. And then on the right, we have wild oats. This is a benefatua. And you'll see that the spikelets are on these tiny little, these dainty pedicels that come off of the main stem. So this is our raceme, because we have these little stalks beneath the spikelets that attach it to the main stem. And then we have two different types of panicles. So both of these, remember, have the spikelets on a little stalk that attaches to a branch off of the main stem. So they're not directly attached to the stem. And in the left picture, this is tridens, white tridens. And it's hard to see that it's a panicle at all because they're so close together. So the spikelets are coming off of the branches, but then the branches are really close to the stem. So it looks like they're all bunched together. We call that a contracted panicle, which just means that the branches, they never really open up whenever the grass matures. And we'll contrast that with this love grass, this Eragrostis. And Eragrostis has what we call a spreading or an open panicle, which means that you can see clearly where the branches come off of the main stem. And then furthermore, you can see where the spikelets come off of those branches. So these are our examples of panicles. And that's all the anatomy that I had. There's certainly more that you could dive into. Again, if you have the opportunity, I would encourage you to buy or to look into some more resources and get to know some more terms, or just refamiliarize yourself with these ones. I think a lot of this is just repetition of just encountering it enough that you feel comfortable talking about the ligule or the spikelet. And some tips that I have for encouraging people to dive into the language of grasses are just to take it one grass at a time. I think, like I just spent 20 minutes talking about words that you've probably never heard of. So it can be discouraging, I think, to a lot of people to get excited about grasses. But if you just take it one plant at a time, use multiple resources, don't put a lot of pressure on yourself, I think you'll find that with repetitions, it becomes easier. If you have a field guide, I would spend time at home reading it, maybe with your coffee in the morning. Just thumb through, read about 1 or 2 grasses a day. And you'll be surprised when you do that, and then you go out into the field, you'll say, oh, this plant reminds me of something I read about. And you'll already be one step closer to making an ID on that plant. And again, don't be discouraged by all of these terms that seem really inaccessible. Have a dictionary on hand, or have, Google open and be ready to look up words. I know for me, when I was working with grasses, it was part of a job and I was doing it 10 hours a day. And I would have these moments where I would be keying out a grass and I'd have to say, okay, what does that word mean? And I'd look it up. And I'd say, oh, okay, yeah, that's what that means. And then 5 minutes later, I'd encounter the exact same word and have to look it up again. And that's just part of, you know, if you're learning a language, that would be part of it too. And so just taking the time to have those encounters, both with the plants and with the terms that we use to talk about the plants, can be really helpful. And feel free to use as many resources as you think you need to make an ID and to confirm IDs that you've made. And certainly don't ever be afraid to make the wrong identification. I've done it a number of times and I'm continuing to do it. And I think that's part of the learning process in anything. And if you want to really become proficient at identifying them, you have to really enjoy it. So become addicted to the satisfaction that you get when you make an ID of a grass, because it is really satisfying. Because grasses are difficult. Anyone who works with plants can tell you that they're not easy to get into. But once you take the first steps and once you get into it, I think you'll find that being able to do something that is challenging has a high reward. And that's what I think. And that's why I still study grasses.